The Glasswater Conservatory held 200 guests and a table stacked with gifts worth fortunes. Simone Carrington, Gideon Pembroke's fiancée, lifted the last item, a rough, hand-welded model bus made from salvaged parts, and raised it for the room to see. She looked at Renee Holloway, a single mother in a plain dress with oil still on her hands. "A billionaire's 40th birthday," Simone said, "and someone brought him scrap metal." She ordered security to remove Renee from the estate, but Gideon stepped forward and took the model. He turned it over and his breath caught. On the base was an engraved symbol, one he had only ever seen on his late mother's private designs. He asked Renee where it came from. What she said next would tear apart everything he thought he knew. "If you've ever been dismissed by someone who decided your value before you opened your mouth, stay with this one. It goes somewhere you won't see coming." The Glasswater Conservatory had been designed to impress, and on the night of Gideon Pembroke's 40th birthday, it succeeded without effort. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls framed the dark surface of the Chesapeake Bay, and the water caught the light from inside chandeliers, candles, the pale glow of city skyline beyond the trees. 200 guests moved through the space in evening wear that cost more than most people's monthly rent, carrying champagne flutes and conversation about markets, mergers, and the kind of decisions that shifted whole industries. Gideon stood near the center of it all, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, and wearing the controlled smile of a man who had learned long ago how to be present at a party without fully arriving. He was 40 years old, the founder and CEO of Pembroke Civic Dynamics, and his company's electric buses now ran in 14 major American cities. He had built something real, something that moved people literally, and he was proud of it. But on nights like this, surrounded by wealth performing itself, he sometimes found himself thinking about his mother, about the notebooks she left behind, about the company she never got to see become what it was. Dr. Lenora Pembroke had died when Gideon was in his early 20s, before the first investment round closed, before the first bus rolled off the line. His father had taken her prototypes and her research and turned them into a business. Gideon had stepped into leadership a decade later, carrying her name like a compass. He had always believed he was finishing what she started. He had no reason to think otherwise. Renee Holloway arrived at Cedar Haven Estate with her 9-year-old son Josiah and a bus model wrapped in brown paper tucked under her arm. She had dressed carefully, the nicest dress she owned pressed the night before, but the estate's valet parking and the wall of designer gowns near the entrance made it clear within 30 seconds that careful was not the same as enough. There were traces of engine grease along her knuckles that she'd scrubbed twice and still couldn't fully remove. She worked as a maintenance technician for the city's transit authority, which meant she spent her days diagnosing the mechanical failures of the same buses that Pembroke Civic Dynamics had built. She knew those machines better than most engineers who had designed them. She also ran a free after-school program called Second Spark Workshop, out of a rented space in West Baltimore, where she taught kids from her neighborhood how to build things with their hands. The program had recently received a small community grant from Pembroke's Civic Fund, which was how she and Josiah had ended up on the guest list, representatives of a local education initiative invited as a gesture of corporate goodwill. Josiah had asked to make the gift himself. He'd spent 3 weeks on it using salvaged parts from buses that had been decommissioned and legally stripped wheel bearings, strips of recycled aluminum, a length of copper wire that he'd shaped into the roofline. The finished model was unmistakably a bus, unmistakably handmade, and unmistakably out of place among the crystal decanters and framed original artwork stacked on the gift table. Josiah had checked the model's wheel alignment 4 separate times before they left the apartment. He wanted the wheels to roll true. On the drive over, he'd looked out the window and asked his mother whether Gideon Pembroke actually liked buses or just liked the money from them. Renee hadn't answered right away. She kept her eyes on the road and said quietly that they were about to find out. Inside the conservatory, Simone Carrington noticed Renee within minutes of her arrival. It was Simone's party as much as Gideon's. She had planned every detail of the evening, from the floral arrangement to the seating chart to the order in which the gifts would be presented. She was the kind of person who understood how appearances worked. and how quickly the wrong image could complicate the right moment. When she saw Renee's dress, her shoes, and the brown paper package, she cataloged all three without expression. When a staff member told her the woman's name, Simone's face stayed neutral. But something shifted behind her eyes. She had heard that name before. 6 months earlier, when the company's legal department had forwarded her a formal request from a Renee Holloway asking that Pembroke Civic Dynamics review certain intellectual property claims related to its founding technology. Simone had read the letter, assessed its potential to interfere with the merger timeline, and signed the rejection herself. She had assumed that would be the end of it. She had not expected Renee Holloway to show up at the birthday party carrying a package. The gift presentation began an hour into the evening. Guests gathered around the table as Gideon worked through the offerings, a vintage chronograph, a painting by an artist he'd mentioned once at a dinner, a set of architectural drawings for a private retreat. Each gift was received with warmth and placed carefully aside. When Simone reached for the brown paper package near the back of the table, it wasn't an accident. She had chosen it deliberately. She unwrapped it slowly, making sure the room was watching before she raised the model bus above the table. The aluminum caught the chandelier light in a flat, graceless way. The paint was uneven. The wheel bearings were visible in a way that no commercial product would allow. Simone turned it over in her hands with the careful curiosity of someone examining something they'd found on a sidewalk, and then she looked across the room at Renee. "Did someone actually think," Simone said, her voice carrying the specific pitch of amusement that requires no effort and lands everywhere, "that a billionaire wanted salvage metal for his birthday?" A few people laughed. Most of the room went very still. Josiah stood beside his mother, and his expression did not collapse the way a child's might. He didn't cry. He looked at the model in Simone's hands, the one he had spent 3 weeks building, the one whose wheels he had checked 4 times, and he went quiet in the way children go quiet when they are trying to understand something that doesn't make sense yet. Renee put her hand on his shoulder. Simone set the model on the edge of the table with the careful indifference of someone returning something to lost and found. She noted that the welds on the body were visible and irregular, and referred to the gift as a cheap toy dressed up as a heartwarming story. Josiah, still watching, said in a steady voice that he had put each wheel on himself, and that he'd chosen the bearings because they matched the turning radius of a real low-floor transit bus. Simone looked at him the way adults sometimes look at children who have spoken out of turn in a room that wasn't meant for them. She said that children should be taught about limits and about the difference between the rooms they belonged in and the rooms they were simply allowed to enter. No one in the conservatory said anything. The ones who might have disagreed looked at their glasses instead. Renee's first instinct was the same instinct she had every time something threatened her son: remove him from the situation before it got worse. She began to reach for his hand. But Simone wasn't finished. She gestured to one of the security staff near the door and said in a tone that managed to sound reasonable that given the guest's professional background, she said, "maintenance work," the way someone might say unverified. It would be appropriate to have her bag checked before she left the conservatory. The implication was not subtle. Renee stood completely still. Then Simone added that Second Spark Workshop's community grant would naturally need to be reviewed, given that its representative had created an awkward situation at a private event. She said, naturally, and awkward situation, and none of it was technically a threat. And all of it was. The 2 security staff began moving toward Renee from opposite sides of the room. Josiah looked up at his mother. Renee looked down at him. She thought about his question in the car, the one she hadn't answered yet. She thought about the box of documents her mother had pressed into her hands in a hospital room 14 years ago, and the words that came with them. Don't bring these out until they're ready to face the truth. She thought about whether tonight was that night, or whether she was about to make things worse for both of them by staying. Josiah said very quietly so that only she could hear, "Do you think Grandma would want us to leave right now?" She didn't answer him. She didn't need to. The security staff were 3 steps away when Gideon Pembroke crossed the room. He said calmly and without raising his voice that everyone should stop. The staff stopped. The room, which had been moving at its usual party pace for the last several minutes, stopped with them. Gideon picked up the bus model from the edge of the table where Simone had left it. He turned it over in his hands the way someone does when they are not performing interest, but actually feeling it. Along the underside of the base, near the rear axle bracket, there was a small mark, 2 letters pressed into the metal with a fine engraving tool inside a circle no larger than a thumbnail. It was not a manufacturer's stamp. It was not a serial number. It was the same mark Gideon had seen in his mother's private notebooks on the pages she had been proudest of. She had pressed that symbol into metal and margin and prototype edge every time she made something she believed in. He looked at Renee. The security staff had not moved, but they had not moved closer either. The 200 guests in the Glasswater Conservatory were entirely silent. "Where did this come from?" Gideon asked. Renee held his gaze. She looked once at Josiah, who gave her the small, certain nod of a 9-year-old who has already decided, and then she looked back at Gideon Pembroke. "If you want to know who actually built the technology your family made their fortune on," she said, "you need to open the compartment under that model yourself." Gideon carried the bus model out of the Glasswater Conservatory and into his father's old study at the far end of the estate, a room that still smelled like cedar and machine oil, that still had a reel-to-reel recorder sitting on the shelf where it had sat for 30 years. Renee walked beside him. Josiah stayed close to his mother's side. Several members of the company's board who had been among the guests that evening followed without being invited and did not leave when they arrived. Simone followed last, and she closed the door behind her. Gideon set the model on the desk and found the seam along the base. It was fitted carefully. Josiah had built it to open cleanly the way a real service panel should. Inside the compartment, folded with the precision of someone who had handled documents for a long time, were several items. A set of engineering drawings on paper that had yellowed at the edges, a small brass plate, a sealed letter, and a tape reel in a paper sleeve. The drawings were covered in handwritten calculations. In the bottom right corner of the top sheet, 2 signatures appeared side by side. One was his mother's, the looping capital L that Gideon had seen on every notebook in her study. The other was a name he had never encountered in any of the company's official histories, Dr. Yvette Holloway. Before Gideon could say anything, Simone spoke from across the room. She said the documents were likely reproductions, that original technical drawings from that era were publicly accessible through patent filings, that aging paper was not difficult to replicate, and that a person with the right motivation and enough time could construct a convincing forgery. She said it evenly, the way someone presents a reasonable alternative, and she looked at the board members as she said it, rather than at Gideon. Renee did not raise her voice. She said she had never asked Gideon for money, had never contacted the company asking for a settlement, and that if Simone wanted to explain why a maintenance technician would spend years fabricating a story that only asked for an acknowledgement and nothing else, she was welcome to try. What she actually wanted, she said, was for Gideon to play the tape. Simone said that a birthday party was not the appropriate setting for a legal dispute. The board members shifted but said nothing. Gideon looked at the tape reel for a long moment, then crossed to the shelf and loaded it into the recorder. The voice that came out of the speakers was one Gideon had not heard in nearly 2 decades. It was his mother's. The particular rhythm of her speech, the way she ran words together when she was excited about a problem, the small sound she made when she was thinking. He stood with his hands still on the recorder and did not move. In the recording, Dr. Lenora Pembroke was talking to someone she called Yvette. She was describing the regenerative braking prototype they had been testing together, a system that recovered kinetic energy during deceleration and fed it back into the drive motor, dramatically reducing power consumption over a standard transit route. She said the thermal management solution that made the whole system viable had been Yvette's. She said clearly and without qualification that the design would not exist without Yvette's years of materials research, and that when they filed for incorporation, both their names would be on the founding documents because that was the only honest way to do it. The tape ran for 11 minutes. Near the end, Lenora's voice grew quieter, more careful. She mentioned a meeting with investors, Men who had expressed concern about the optics of two black women engineers leading a transit technology company into a major funding round. She said she had told them it wasn't a discussion. She said Yvette had been there and had heard the same thing. The recording ended there mid-sentence, the way recordings do when someone forgets to keep pressing a button. The study was completely silent when the reels stopped turning. Josiah, who had been sitting on the edge of a chair near the window, looked up at Gideon. "So Grandma built the bus your company sells?" he asked. He was not being confrontational. He was 9 years old and wanted the information to be accurate the way he always did when he was working through something that didn't add up. The question sat in the room longer than any of the adults' words had. Gideon turned to the remaining documents. The brass plate read, L. Pembroke and Y. Holloway, prototype 01. The sealed letter was from Yvette Holloway, addressed to no one in particular, dated several years after Lenora's death. In it, she described being approached by a group of the company's early advisors and investors after Lenora passed. Men who told her that proceeding with a shared founding claim would compromise the company's ability to raise capital. She had been asked to sign a temporary agreement stepping back from her ownership position with a written assurance that her stake would be formally restored after the first investment round closed. She had signed because she needed the work to continue and because she believed the promise was real. The investment round closed. No one restored anything. There was one more document in the compartment. It was a letter from Pembroke Civic Dynamics legal department dated 6 months earlier, formally rejecting a request from Renee Holloway to have the company review its founding intellectual property records. The rejection had been signed by Simone Carrington. Gideon read the signature twice. He set the letter on the desk and looked at Simone, and for the first time that evening, the controlled steadiness he wore like a second suit showed a fault line. Simone did not look away. She said she had reviewed the request and determined it lacked the legal standing to warrant a formal response, that she had been protecting the company from an unverified claim at a critical moment in the merger timeline, and that everything she had done was within her authority. Then she looked at the board members and said that if Gideon allowed an unverified claim to become a public story before the merger closed, they stood to lose a transaction worth more than most people in that room would earn in their lifetimes, and that the people most likely to lose their jobs if the deal fell apart were not the ones standing in that study. The board members did not take Gideon's side. They recommended that the matter be handled through proper legal channels, that nothing be said publicly until counsel had reviewed everything, and that the evening conclude without further incident. What happened next took less than 48 hours. Simone's communications team released a video clip the following morning. It had been shot inside the conservatory during the gift presentation, and it had been edited with precision, trimmed to begin at the moment Renee stepped forward and end before Gideon crossed the room. In the version that circulated online, Renee appeared to be confronting a billionaire at his own birthday party, producing documents from a handmade gift and demanding acknowledgement of what she was owed. The clip ran 47 seconds. By afternoon, it had been picked up by 3 celebrity gossip platforms and a local news aggregator, all of which ran variations of the same headline, Single Mother Attempts to Claim Stake in Billionaire's Company at Birthday Party. Josiah found out at school 2 days later. A classmate had seen the headline on his older brother's phone. By the end of lunch, the story had moved through the grade the way things do among children, compressed, distorted, and delivered without mercy. Josiah stopped eating with his usual group and took his lunch to the far end of the cafeteria. He didn't tell his mother that evening. She noticed that he'd stopped asking questions at the dinner table those long, sidewinding questions about how things worked, about why the city buses used more fuel than they were supposed to, about whether a gear ratio could be optimized for a specific road grade. He just ate and went to his room. That silence cost Renee more than any legal threat that followed. The City Transit Authority placed her on administrative leave, pending an internal review, citing concerns that components used in the model bus may have been taken from decommissioned vehicles in the maintenance yard. She submitted documentation showing the parts had been formally cleared for disposal, but the process would take time, and in the meantime she had no income. She sat at her kitchen table one night and counted the weeks she had, before she could no longer cover the rent. The second Spark workshop lost 2 of its 3 funding sources within a week. Both organizations cited reputational concerns. The landlord sent a notice of termination shortly after, explaining that the attention surrounding the situation had made the arrangement untenable. Renee called her students' parents one by one to explain that the program was closing temporarily. The parents were understanding. That almost made it worse. Simone's attorneys sent a formal letter requiring Renee to surrender all documents retrieved from the bus model, cease any public reference to Pembroke Civic Dynamics in connection with intellectual property claims, and sign a statement confirming she had no legal standing to pursue ownership or compensation. The letter noted that failure to comply within 30 days would result in civil litigation. It was written in the kind of language designed to make a person feel that resistance was not only futile, but irresponsible, that the sensible and dignified thing was to let go and move on. Meanwhile, Gideon had been formally suspended from operational control of the company by a board vote that Simone's allies had organized with notable efficiency. The board cited his handling of a sensitive legal matter at a public event as evidence that personal considerations were interfering with his fiduciary responsibilities. His access to the company's historical records and archive was revoked. The merger, still technically alive, was described in internal memos as fragile. Simone came to him with what she framed as a path forward. She told him that if he issued a public statement clarifying that the documents presented at his party were unverified, that the company stood by its official history, and that he had full confidence in the legal process that had already reviewed and dismissed the Holloway claim, the board would restore his position. The merger would close, and everything he had spent 20 years building would remain intact. She said it gently, the way one might explain a correct answer to someone who had chosen the wrong one. She also said they could still get married in the spring. Renee made her decision alone at the kitchen table late at night after Josiah had gone to sleep. She looked at the invoice from the landlord. She looked at the transit authority's suspension notice. She looked at the door to her son's room and thought about him sitting alone at the far end of a cafeteria. She thought about her mother, about the box of documents pressed into her hands in that hospital room, about being told to wait until the Pembrokes were ready to face the truth. Then she thought about something else her mother had said, quieter and less like an instruction, that a name buried long enough starts to feel like it never existed. And the only thing that kept it real was someone who refused to forget it. She was not going to sign the attorney's letter. She was not going to hand over the tape or the drawings or the brass plate. But she was also not going to let Josiah keep paying the price for a fight that the other side had far more resources to sustain. She would withdraw the public claim. She would stop talking. She would take Josiah and leave Baltimore, and she would keep everything her mother had left her until the day she had enough standing to use it properly. She had almost finished packing 2 boxes of their most important things when her phone rang. It was Gideon. He did not ask her to stay. He did not apologize or explain himself or fill the silence with the kind of language people use when they want credit for a decision they haven't fully made yet. He told her that he had spent the last 2 days going through his mother's study at Cedar Haven Estate, the room that had been kept exactly as she left it, untouched by anyone, including him for reasons he had never examined too closely until now. He told her what he had found, and then he said that he was going to hold a press conference the following morning at the old workshop on Mercer Street, the building where his mother and Yvette Holloway had built the first prototype together decades before anyone had heard of Pembroke Civic Dynamics. He was going to tell the truth about all of it, he said, whether or not she was there to hear it. Then he asked if she wanted to be there. Renee stood in her kitchen with her hand on one of the half-packed boxes and did not answer immediately. She looked at the closed door to Josiah's room. She thought about her mother's words, not the instruction, but the quieter thing underneath it, that a name buried long enough starts to feel like it never existed, and the only thing that kept it real was someone who refused to forget it. She told Gideon she would be there. After she hung up, she went to Josiah's room and found him awake, sitting cross-legged on his bed with the pieces of the bus model arranged around him in a careful grid, each component separated and set in order the way he organized things when he was thinking hard. He had taken the model apart 2 days earlier and she had not asked him why. Now she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the pieces with him. He asked if they were still leaving. She said not yet. She told him what Gideon had said, keeping it simple and accurate the way she always talked to him, without softening it into something easier or inflating it into something more heroic than it was. A man was going to tell the truth tomorrow, she said. They were going to be there for it. Josiah looked at the wheel assemblies laid out in front of him, then began putting the model back together. He worked quietly and methodically, fitting each bearing into its housing and checking the alignment before moving to the next. He didn't say anything until the model was whole again, and then he looked up at his mother and said he wanted to bring it with them. She said yes. What Gideon had found in his mother's study had not come easily. He went through the room the way he had avoided going through it for years, not all at once, but in the way of someone who has finally run out of reasons to stay away. He found her notebooks stacked in the cabinet she had always used for active projects, and he found what he had already suspected. Pages were missing from the sections that covered the first prototype. Not lost, removed. The cuts were clean and deliberate, done with a straight edge, leaving narrow strips of paper along the binding that told him exactly how much had been taken. Behind a locked drawer in the writing desk, he found a letter. It was in his mother's handwriting, addressed to his father, and it had never been sent. In it, Lenora asked her husband to do one specific thing if anything happened to her. Make sure Yvette's name stayed on the founding documents. Not as a courtesy, not as an acknowledgement, as a legal fact, because it was a legal fact, and because Yvette had earned it the same way Lenora had, by solving a problem no one else had been able to solve, by giving years of work to something that mattered, by being a partner in the fullest sense of the word. Gideon read the letter 3 times. He understood, with the particular clarity that comes from evidence rather than suspicion, that his father had known. Perhaps not all of it, perhaps not the specific mechanism by which Yvette's name had been removed, but enough. He had known there was something unresolved, and he had chosen in the difficult early years of the company to resolve it later. Later became never. Never became official history. Official history became the story Gideon had been told his entire adult life about what his mother had built and who had built it with her. He sat in the study for a long time with the unsent letter in his hands. He was not angry at his father exactly. He understood the pressure that had existed in those early years, the investors, the advisors, the specific cruelty of a system that required black women engineers to choose between their credit and their survival. His father had not invented that pressure, but he had accommodated it, and the accommodation had compounded over decades into something Gideon had unknowingly inherited and unknowingly profited from. The fortune, the company, the name on 14 cities' worth of electric buses, all of it had been built on a foundation that included Yvette Holloway's work and excluded her name. That was the part he could not rationalize away. The press conference the next morning was held at the old workshop on Mercer Street, a long, low-ceilinged space with concrete floors and fluorescent lighting that made everything look exactly like what it was. No staging, no backdrop, no communications team with pre-approved talking points. Gideon stood at a folding table with the documents from the bus model laid out in front of him. Renee stood to his left. Josiah stood beside her, holding the reassembled model in both hands. Gideon told the story from the beginning. He described what the tape recording contained. He described the brass plate and the 2 signatures on the original engineering drawings. He read aloud the relevant section of his mother's unsent letter. He explained what the legal rejection letter signed by Simone Carrington 6 months before the birthday party confirmed about who had known what and when. He said that Dr. Yvette Holloway was a co-founder of Pembroke Civic Dynamics in every sense that mattered, that her contribution to the company's core technology had been real and documented, and deliberately obscured, and that his family had benefited from that obscurity for decades. He also announced that he was ending his engagement to Simone Carrington. He said it without drama and without elaboration, except to note that his reason was not the scene at the birthday party. His reason was the letter she had signed, the one that showed she had understood exactly what Renee was asking, had understood that the claim was grounded in documentation and had chosen to reject it and then use the company's resources to discredit the person making it. That was not a mistake in judgment. That was a deliberate choice, and he was not willing to build a life with someone who made choices like that. The merger was formally suspended that afternoon. The company's stock dropped sharply in the first few days following the press conference. Several board members who had been involved in suppressing access to the historical archive resigned before a formal investigation could recommend their removal. The remaining board, facing both the legal exposure of the situation and the unexpected wave of public support that followed Gideon's statement, voted to restore his operational authority and commission an independent audit of the company's founding records. The legal process that followed took months, but its outcome was not in serious doubt once the original documents had been authenticated. The agreement Yvette had signed decades earlier, the temporary step back with its unmet promise of restoration, was found to be unenforceable under the conditions in which it had been executed. The Holloway family's intellectual property claim was formally recognized. An equity agreement was drawn up that acknowledged Renee and Josiah as legal heirs to Yvette's founding stake, with a structured share of the company's profits transferred into a trust established in Yvette's name. Renee accepted the settlement, not because she needed to be persuaded, but because she understood the difference between what it was and what it wasn't. It was not charity. It was not a gesture. It was the delayed payment of a debt that had been accumulating since before she was born, and accepting it was not weakness. It was her mother's work being given its correct value, finally, after everything it had cost to get here. She used a portion of the settlement to establish a permanent home for Second Spark Workshop. Not a rented space this time, a building owned outright with equipment that didn't need to be borrowed, and a lease that no landlord could terminate because of a news cycle. She named the facility the Holloway Pembroke Center for Civic Innovation, and she ran it herself under her own governance without reporting to anyone at Pembroke Civic Dynamics. She also accepted a seat on the company's newly formed Technical Ethics Board, where her role was specifically to review how the company documented and credited the contributions of inventors, engineers, and community partners. The Transit Authority completed its review and confirmed that every component in the bus model had come from properly decommissioned vehicles. Renee's suspension was lifted and her record cleared. She was offered her old position back. She declined, not out of bitterness, but because she had somewhere else to be. 1 year after the birthday party at Cedar Haven Estate, Gideon drove to the Holloway Pembroke Center on a Tuesday afternoon. In the main workshop, a group of students were gathered around a small electric bus prototype they had designed themselves over the previous semester. Josiah was among them, 10 years old now, standing at the work table presenting his section of the project to the group, explaining with quiet precision why the angle of the wheel-bearing housing affected energy recovery during deceleration. He had been working on that specific problem for 3 months. He had figured it out himself. In the main hall of the center, the bus model from the birthday party sat in a glass case near the entrance. It had been cleaned but not restored. The uneven paint was still there, the visible weld lines, the wheel bearings that Josiah had chosen for their correct turning radius. Below the case, a small plaque had been mounted on the wall. It did not carry Gideon's name or the company's name, or any language about corporate legacy or philanthropic vision. It read, "A gift that gave a name back to history." Behind the case, printed and framed, was a photograph that Renee had found in her mother's belongings. 2 women standing in a workshop that looked very much like the one on Mercer Street. Both of them in work clothes, both of them with grease on their hands, both of them looking directly at the camera with the unguarded ease of people who are exactly where they are supposed to be. Dr. Lenora Pembroke was on the left. Dr. Yvette Holloway was on the right. Between them, partially visible at the edge of the frame, was the front end of a prototype that would eventually become the foundation of a billion-dollar company. Gideon found Renee in the courtyard after the session ended. He asked her the question he had been carrying since the night of the party, whether she had ever regretted bringing the model, given everything it had cost them both to get from that night to this one. Renee thought about Josiah eating alone at the far end of the cafeteria. She thought about the packed boxes in her kitchen, the suspension letter the night she had almost decided that protecting her son meant letting the truth stay buried. She said she had regretted it for a while, not because of what it cost her, but because Josiah had stood in a room full of adults and been told that the things he built didn't belong there, and she had not been able to stop that from happening. But she said she did not regret staying, because her son had also stood in that room and watched his mother refuse to let wealth decide the value of what was true. He had watched her hold on to something difficult when the easier thing was to let it go. And now he was 10 years old, standing at a work table explaining gear ratios and bearing angles to a group of kids who would remember it. Josiah came out to the courtyard a few minutes later. He set the reassembled model bus on the courtyard wall next to the new prototype, the rough one built from salvage, and the clean one built from what the salvage had made possible. He looked at both of them for a moment the way he looked at mechanical things when he was confirming that everything was where it should be. Then he went back inside to finish his work. Gideon stood there looking at the two models side by side, and then at the photograph visible through the hall window, two names that had finally been placed next to each other the way they should have been from the very beginning. Dr. Lenora Pembroke, Dr. Yvette Holloway. Not one story, two. Always two. There's something this story keeps coming back to. The people who built the foundation are not always the ones whose names end up on the door. That's not just history. It happens in workplaces, in families, in every room where someone decides that another person's contribution is inconvenient to acknowledge. Renee didn't walk into that party to make a scene. She walked in because her mother spent a lifetime building something real, and real things deserve to be called by their right name. If that stayed with you, consider subscribing. Every story on this channel is built around that same idea, that the truth is worth carrying even when it's heavy, and that the people who carry it forward quietly are often the most important ones in the room. We'll see you in the next one.